Welcome everyone to the ICNC webinar series. My name is Maciej Bartkowski. I'm Senior Advisor to the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. And I have a great pleasure of hosting today Dr. Steve Chase. And I will moderate his webinar talk titled How Agents Provocateurs Harm Our Movements and What Can Be Done About It. And this webinar conversation is based on the ICNC newly released publication that is written by Steve, How Agents Provocateurs Harm Our Movements. And that publication is available for free from the ICNC website. And my colleague Bruce will drop a link to every one of you in the chat room to open, upload, download that publication. And so you have that in your library. So why are Steve's publication and this webinar important? Well, the repressive opponents of civil resistance movements are very hard at work to undermine nonviolent activism. And they understand very well the power of nonviolent resistance, even sometimes better than the ones who contemplate engaging in such actions or supporting them. And the repressive actors also recognize that one effective way to counter and discredit nonviolent movements that challenge them is to make those movements violent and less disciplined. And one way to do so is for the movement opponents to deploy and use so-called agent provocateurs, basically people that are often paid by a state and who are sent to infiltrate movements by pretending to be activists or their allies. And these provocateurs then work to sow disunity, create disruption, including promoting or engaging in violence. And they say oftentimes that this violence is justified and helpful for the movement. So in fact, the goals of agent provocateurs are simple: to discourage participation in the movement, to discredit public support for the movement, and to give oppressive regime justification to use violence against activism without at the same time facing public backlash. It is thus also concerning that sometimes within movements, agent provocateurs can find naive or unwitting allies and so-called useful fools that are susceptible to agent provocateurs manipulation and adopt actions that these agents promote. So in this webinar, Steve will highlight the very dynamic of agent provocateurs and their work. He will highlight historical examples of agents provocateurs, as well as specific strategies, how movements can better prepare to handle effectively such people and their damaging behavior and actions. And Steve's exceptional and important study is of great resource for people who consider using nonviolent resistance more effectively. His work will also provide an excellent, I think, learning and training tool for those who want to see activists being even more successful in achieving their goals. So I would like to remind our audience that we are live tweeting from the ICNC Twitter at Civil Resistance, and people can share their reactions using hashtag ICNC webinars. So I will briefly introduce our main speaker today, and then I will give him the virtual floor. So Steve Chase is a longtime activist, educator, and writer. He has been an editor at South End Press, the founding director of Antioch University's graduate-level training program in advocacy for social justice and sustainability, and he was also a former manager of academic initiatives for the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, and we are close colleagues. We've been working for a number of years on different educational programs that are focusing on civil resistance, and I'm very happy, to welcome Steve back here. And he's currently the Assistant Director of Solidarity 2020 and Beyond, which is a solidarity network and community of practice for grassroots movement organizers in the Global South that use advocacy, peace building, and nonviolent resistance to win sustainability, rights, freedom, and justice. So Steve, again, it's a great pleasure of having you back here. And please go ahead and take over from me here.
Okay, thank you so much. I think people can see my screen, correct? All right. So it's a great honor to do a webinar, even though doing a webinar of a recently published book is much harder than I thought. I've been really looking forward to it, and I want to thank everybody at ICNC for making both the book possible and publishing it and making available for free, as well as print copies and ebooks. That's terrific. And so I think we'll jump right in. One thing about my book is that it grows out of a tradition, as Maciej was talking about, which is both a practitioner tradition of civil resistance, but also researching movements and figuring out how things work. And I sure want to encourage people to read my book, which the cover graphic is on the right there, but on the left, is a great book written by one of the main researchers who I got to work with a lot when I worked at ICNC. But she's written several academic studies and things, but this book is written to concerned citizens, activists, and organizers, and it explains in a very simple and engaging question and answer way, defining what civil resistance is, contrasting it with political violence and armed struggle, looking at the theory of power, giving you a sense of the kinds of strategies and multiple tactics that are available, and that it's not just protests. And she also spends a little time, about 2 pages, talking about agent provocateurs, which I think is so important in grounding in this discussion. And my book is essentially just a way to sort of expand her 2 pages, again, to address to activists and organizers about what are the dimensions and dynamics of that, so we can be prepared to handle it and minimize the damage that agent provocateurs and the kinds of behaviors that they encourage people to take within movements, that'll be less damaging and will increase the effectiveness. Now, among the findings that are really important in Erica's book, and she talks about the overall record and the good empirical case that civil resistance is twice as effective as armed struggle historically, and nails that down. But she also, because she's more and more thinking about how to make her research useful to activists, she focuses on what are some of the dimensions of the most successful civil resistance campaigns, because not all of them win. So what are the things that help it win? So she broke it down, and it's based on her studies, but other academics and researchers' studies too, and also the experience of practitioners who have been reflecting on their work. But basically, civil resistance movements are most successful when they expand participation. And that includes not just large numbers of people, but it also means that you're building coalitions across a diversity of sectors within the population. That makes a movement very, very strong if you can achieve that. And then she talks about one of the major findings is you need a movement is going to have different players and different people, but the more they can play complementary roles rather than be antagonistic, that's hugely helpful. So building unity, a working unity, a collaborative and complementary role within the wider ecosystem of a social movement. They've also determined.
Sorry, we are stuck on your opening slide. Could you switch it over so we can see the books you're discussing?
I'm very sorry. Can you see the 2 books now?
No, we're still seeing the opening slide.
Now, can you see the 2 books?
Yes, we can. Thank you so much, Steve.
I'm really sorry about that. And let's go one further. So this is the slide where I'm talking about some core findings about how to make movements even have a greater chance of achieving their goals, whether it's social justice, political freedom, human rights, sustainability. So I've talked about large numbers, I've talked about unity and being collaborative, but also movements that just aren't spontaneous and just doing, well, let's do a tactic that's familiar to us, but really carefully thinking about how to do strategic planning and use a sequence of various tactics that meet the demand in the struggle against movement opponents and power holders. And then one that's very important, and it's very important to the book that I wrote about agent provocateurs, is that movements that can maintain very high levels of nonviolent discipline, that increases their chances of success. And there's various dynamics which we can go over in the question and answer period at the end if people are interested. But I think as we talk about agent provocateurs, that'll become clearer about why. So in the 2 pages, she she defines agent provocateurs. And so there are undercover agents working for movement opponents, and they infiltrate movements, they pretend to be activists, and then they behave in ways that are designed to do the things that Maciej was talking about. And if you think about the 4 elements of success that I just showed you from Erica's book, it's pretty telling. They create disunity and animosity by the way they behave. They try to lower participation and the diversity of the movement. They try to make it more sectarian and fringe and brittle, and to have the general public be afraid of it. They try to figure out various ways to disrupt effective strategic planning. And then very importantly, and it'll be a major focus of what I'm talking about today, is that agent provocateurs, while pretending to be activists, both engage in violence and vandalism and things that may be wildly counterproductive, or they promote it and try to encourage sincere activists to engage in that stuff, to amplify that. And what is the purpose of that? It's to blame this all on the movement, use it to discredit the movement, and very importantly, it means being able to justify harsh repression without a public outcry. Because if a movement is seen as violent, sort of as fringe and small, and just destructive and sort of common criminals, or at worst terrorists, a lot of people will be afraid of the movement rather than sympathetic to it, and they will allow authorities to justify very harsh repression. And so what I want to do now just is I'm going to play a 3-minute clip just to show that this question of agent provocateurs is, it's being discussed in mass media. A lot of activists are becoming more aware of the problem. And so I'm just going to quick play this, and you can listen to it. And as you're listening to it, you can sort of look at this definition and the key kinds of goals of provocateurs.
Hello, I'm James Menendez. Welcome to NewsHour, the BBC World Service. We're coming to you live from London. And our top story today takes us to Kazakhstan in Central Asia at the end of a week of violent unrest and indeed many deaths. The security forces in the country say they've killed at least 26 people and arrested more than 3,000 after protesters attacked government buildings, including setting fire to the mayor's office in the main city, Almaty. The Interior Ministry says 18 officers have also been killed. The violence seems to have abated, at least for now, but only after that initial crackdown, the arrival of troops from Russia, and a promise by the president Kassym-Jomart Tokayev to fire without warning on what he called violent criminals and terrorists.
Terrorists continue to damage public and private property and use weapons against citizens. I gave an order to law enforcement agencies and the army to open fire without warning. There have been calls abroad for the parties to move the negotiations to a peaceful resolution of the problems. What nonsense! What kind of negotiations can there be with criminals, with murderers? We have to deal with armed and trained bandits, both local and foreign. That's why they have to be destroyed, and that will be done soon. Almaty alone was attacked by 20,000 bandits. Their action showed a clear plan of attack on military, administrative, and social facilities in almost all regions. Well-coordinated actions, high combat readiness, and animal cruelty. The counter-terrorist operation continues. The militants have not laid down their arms, continue committing crimes, or are preparing for them. The fight against them must be brought to an end. Those who do not surrender will be eliminated.
Opposition parties are banned in the country, so it is far from clear how any dialogue with the protesters might proceed. I've been talking to one member of the unofficial opposition, Bota Jaldamali, is from the Democratic Choice of Kazakhstan, or QDT. She spoke to me from Belgium, where she has political asylum. President Tokayev has called the protesters violent criminals and also terrorists. Who are the protesters? Are there people out on the streets who aren't from your organization, for example, aren't those who are fighting for greater democracy in Kazakhstan, but may have other ideas, other interests?
There are two sides. The civil society, the people of Kazakhstan, those who we call peaceful protesters, and there are a lot of our activists. And the other side is Nazarbayev's regime and those who support them or are controlled by them. They say that there are some looters, criminals, even terrorists, even foreign-trained terrorists. But obviously it's a lie. They started saying that in order to discredit the protest, actually those criminal mobs, they are controlled by the regime. They're very much closely controlled by the secret services, as well as nephews of President Nazarbayev, because they were always kind of merged with organized criminal groups in the country.
So hold on, you're saying these people are what? Agent provocateurs who are there to stir up trouble?
Absolutely. So they burn cars, they organize beatings, and they really turning this into something violent. And the purpose is to use that violence as a pretext to be able to call peaceful protesters as violent protesters.
So that case, I'm not sure if it was a serious amount of agent provocateurs or not. I'm not close enough. People will need to study, but it is plausible given the research I've done. The dynamics suggest that it's plausible, which leads me to my new book that just came out from ICNC Press. And so I listed the contents here. There's an introduction, and then I go to just give a sense of sort of fairly short case studies. Some are just a paragraph long, some are a couple pages long, of snapshots of agent provocateur behavior around the world, and some places where there's the movement deals well with agent provocateurs, and others where it's sort of sidetracked and it loses ground. But the heart of the book is a detailed case study about agent provocateurs in my own country, from working against the US Black Liberation Movement from the 1950s, and certainly the 60s, but then I also update it to current sort of racial justice organizing that's happening in the United States. Then the fourth section is I point out that not all of violence that emerges in a civil resistance movement can be blamed on agent provocateurs. There are some people who argue that, as Mache said, sincere activists, but in my view, strategically misguided, who are arguing this, if we mix at least low levels of political violence with civil resistance, will strengthen the movement. And I really look at that critically, and that. But given all that, then I talk, how do we respond effectively? Because it's important to understand what's been going on sort of historically and currently, but we also need to figure out a way, how do we deal with the problem of agent provocateurs, and how do we deal with agent provocateur-like behavior by sincere but sort of either emotionally triggered or strategically misguided activists. And so what I'm going to talk about is going to sort of follow this outline in this webinar, though I won't go into the references. You'll have to get the book for that. So I start out the introduction with a story about this young campus journalist, a student journalist, a guy named Chris Steele, and he interviews Noam Chomsky at Chomsky's office back when he worked at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And they talked about agent provocateurs at some length during the interview. Now, many people are probably familiar with Noam Chomsky. He's one of the most world famous activist scholars around, but he's a linguist, and you can see that on his chalkboard. But he's also a political thinker who's written on social movements, and he's been an activist himself. And so he was a really important person as Chris Steele started noticing some potential things in Denver, where he went to school, in the Occupy movement, and in the early 2000s. I guess it was, where a small group of supposed activists who nobody seemed to really know started yelling and screaming and urging everybody at the encampment, the nonviolent encampment, to march into the neighborhood, break windows, damage cars, which is just irritating passersby and making them afraid, and small business owners, many of whom in that neighborhood were Hispanic, and so they make a ruckus, and it's at that point the police move in and they start beating all the demonstrators, because the people who were creating all that clash sort of disappeared after that, and they cleared the encampment. People were arrested, a lot of people were injured, and he interviewed the organizers, and they said, well, we think that's the work of agent provocateurs. So he started reading more, and this led him to Chomsky. Now, Chomsky surprised him a bit, because Chomsky said that agent provocateurs is a very routine strategy of power elites and movement opponents. And this is throughout time and in many different countries, that it's not just something that was recent or just based in the US. And Steele was really interested in that, and he pressed Chomsky to give some examples from his own activism against the US invasion and occupation against Vietnam in the 60s, which is something that Noam did quite a bit. And I just I'm going to read from the book a bit of a quote from Chomsky when he's talking about his experience. Here's what he said. One lesson that we had to learn pretty quickly is that there is somebody in your group who's shouting, off the cops, or let's break some windows or whatever. You're very likely to see him in court testifying for the police, because that's their job, to try to turn activism into something that'll alienate the public and give them grounds for repression. And that's, we've seen that. And then Chomsky concludes this section of the interview by saying, but it's so routine that there's no point in giving examples. And Steele was really shocked about it. It's so routine and widespread. But he was skeptical that there was no point in giving examples, and I am too. I only go halfway with Chomsky on this. It is routine, yes, the practice of movement opponents using agent provocateurs, but it's not necessarily that well known or understood by enough movement activists and organizers. And so my hope in writing this book was to make this more understood and to explore the dynamics in cases as a preamble to having people start, thinking ever more deeply about how to avoid the problems of either agent provocateurs themselves or agent provocateur-like behavior that, even if it's done by well-meaning people, damages the movement and has the same negative impacts that the agent provocateurs are looking forward for. So I shift into the cases, and the graphics here, on the left, this is the dictator in the 40s of Guatemala. And he proudly said in a public interview, "I am like Hitler. I execute first and I give trials afterwards." And he was a vicious, brutal dictator in Guatemala. So I tell the story about how a movement, first of lawyers, then of teachers, and then of students, and then emerging and developing sympathy among the wider working class, starts working on specific reforms, but it eventually escalates of, we want to overthrow the dictator. And it explains how this general used agent provocateurs, but that it didn't really work that well, and that the movement did some creative things and was successful. I talk about Thailand and in a counter coup demonstration, and they were a little more ragged and they took the bait more of agent provocateurs, but they basically held on. I twin the discussion of Syria and Sudan, because in both cases, in Syria, when there was a large nonviolent movement that was emerging against the Assad regime, pretty dictatorial, and the Assad regime was really nervous about the potential power of a civil resistance movement against it, and they thought it would make the movement easier to defeat if it became an armed struggle. And so actually in an article that Maciej co-wrote, I found this interesting story about how the Syrian authorities would leave trucks and vans with rifles around, hoping that demonstrators would take the bait and take the guns on their way to mass demonstrations and things like that, and shift the whole dynamic of the struggle. And that happened. There was a civil war. Assad is still in power. There's been massive destruction. And then I compare it with Sudan, where the dictator in Sudan during the popular civil resistance revolution, which had a high degree of nonviolent discipline, they were remarkable, but the authorities also left out vans with unlocked doors with lots of guns, hoping that young people on the way to a mass square for a demonstration would find them and use them, and it would change the dynamic. There, a bunch of older women organizers saw the problem, and they just arranged to surround the vans, and so people couldn't even get to them, and they did it that way. And then I talk about Poland and India just to give more geographical, and I won't go into the details here. A really interesting one is an agent provocateur that went by the name Mark Stone, who was deeply embedded for years in ecological campaigns, anti-corporate globalization campaigns, and in peace campaigns, including living with other activists, eventually was exposed. And he had been working for years trying to undermine movements, sometimes with success. But the case that he was testifying against activists, they put together that he was an agent provocateur and brought that up in the testimony. And his activities were both expensive to the taxpayers, and I talk about the specific amount of money for how many years that was revealed, and they were also illegal. And so this really blew things up for the English public. And the Guardian newspaper, which is an English newspaper, ran a lot of coverage of this. And then they started working with activists from throughout the European Union and England and Canada. And they created this database that's still available online. And it's the Undercover Research Project. And they documented close to 1,000 cases of agent provocateur activity in England, the European Union, and Canada. And then I turn to partially what's the graphic on the right, which is this interesting book by Ward Churchill and Jim Vanderwall, which I use a lot in my book, in my research. It's a collection of FBI papers talking about the COINTEL program. And if you don't know about it, that's one of the things that I talk about. But it documents how the FBI engaged in a secret war against progressive social movements in the United States for decades. Going back to the labor movement in the 30s on up, and all these documents came about because a group of about, I think it was 14 peace activists in 1971 who were living in the Philadelphia area, they actually broke into the Media, Pennsylvania field office in the middle of the night. There was very bad security, and they took all the documents and put them in boxes and took them out of the file cabinets. And then as they were going through them, they discovered the existence of this program and document after document. And one of the things that I think is kind of amazing about what the documents is the actual quotes, and I think I have it pulled out from the book here. Yeah, so in these documents, it talked about how the FBI had to use various repressive techniques to, quote, disrupt and destabilize, to, quote, cripple, to, quote, destroy, and neutralize popular movements working for peace and social justice. And this was exposed in mass media. There were hearings in the US Congress. A lot of newspapers started paying attention to this, and it was one of the most massive revelations about agent provocateurs anywhere in the world. Now, my detailed study draws a lot from this explosion of the church committee in Congress, Ward Churchill and Jim Vanderwall's book, and lots of other sources and journalist sources to really look at how agent provocateur activity was used against the US Black Freedom Movement. This is a picture on the left of Martin Luther King In the United States, where I live, yesterday was his holiday. And this is a picture of him being arrested, I think for the first time when he first became active. And that was back in 1956 and 57 with the Montgomery bus boycott, where he was sort of consciously trying to not only adopt, but adapt Mohandas Gandhi's notions of civil resistance and seeing what it could be done to create greater racial justice. So there's various sort of stages that I walk through. The first is from, I think, somewhere in the 40s to the early 60s, there was massive surveillance about the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which was an organization in the United States that particularly focused on Black folks, but it had other racial justice dimensions, but about rights, voting rights, desegregation, full citizenship, pushing back against police brutality. Now, what's interesting about this organization is that it stuck to normal institutional channels for change. It focused on elections, lobbying, and a lot of effort around litigation and using law things. But still, it was so scary to the powers that be that the FBI focused it, and I think I have some quick statistics to give you a sense of the scale of even this, there was, just focused on normal basic institutional channels. So from 1941 to 1966, the FBI surveillance campaign involved 151 undercover informants, close to 3,000 illegal wiretaps on phones, and there were bugs put in the homes and the meeting rooms of key organizational leaders and members. And at one point, the FBI, though they found nothing that said this was like controlled by a foreign government, subversive, trying to overthrow the United States, they pushed to have members of the NAACP, this pretty mainstream reform organization, to register with the government as subversives, and it was only the US Supreme Court that kept that from happening. So that's sort of the background. And then you enter, Martin Luther King, who has tremendous respect for the NAACP, but he's also thinking we need more than normal institutional channels, because the state of democracy in the United States was really compromised. Millions of Black people couldn't vote. The human rights of Black people were not respected. People who tried to register to vote were often lynched or shot and killed, or just disappeared, kidnapped and disappeared. It was pretty horrible. And so after the Montgomery bus boycott successfully integrated the city buses in Montgomery, Alabama, King moved on in about 1957 to create an organization called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And then it was allied with other organizations that also were using nonviolent civil resistance for democracy and justice campaigns. And this shift to using civil resistance, which was, in conjunction with normal institutional channels, really threatened power elites. They called King, in FBI documents, they said he's a national security threat, that he was the most dangerous Negro, Black person in the United States, and he had to be stopped, and they couldn't stick with the legal niceties of stuff. And so, you know, it starts in 1957 with the FBI saying, well, let's keep in touch with his office in Atlanta of the new SCLC. By 1960, there were many, there was more bugging and spying. By 1963, Robert F. Kennedy, who was the Attorney General of the United States, authorized over 1,000 agents going in and spreading out in these various movements. And just a little while later, they also said, your role is no longer just an informant. You need to be agent provocateurs. You need to be creating controversies, animosities, frictions, breakup coalitions, and you need to start trying to whittle away at the nonviolent discipline that was so strong in these resistance movements. And eventually, over time, that had some success, that there was, King died in 1968. He was in Memphis supporting striking garbage workers and the local police department, and there's some evidence that the FBI wasn't involved in this, hired a bunch of young Black kids to go in and break windows at the periphery of the demonstration that King was leading, so they could demonize King as that he's no longer nonviolent, and they really put the heat on him. And so things were changing, and there was more and more talk among activists for racial justice that, nonviolence has failed because things were hard. And so there was, so the next part of this thing, this section of the book, I talk about how FBI and local police, sort of achieved helping create the conditions that created violent flanks. And groups, the one I focus on is like the Black Panthers. And the Panthers started in 1966. They believed in armed self-defense, but they were also involved in like education programs, breakfast programs. They did local electoral organizing. They did a mix of sort of tactics and things, but they were riddled with infiltration and agent provocateurs who increasingly shifted the Panthers, or at least a significant sector of the Panthers, not just doing careful, disciplined, armed self-defense, but also against police brutality, but into offensive violence, including potential bombings and different things. And then the repressive apparatus that scared many of the general public, and the repressive apparatus of the state came down hard on the Black Panthers. And so I go into the details of that. And just to show some continuity, I talk about the movement for Black Lives in 2020, when George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis, and there was this new explosion of civil resistance demonstrations all over the United States. A few of them had trouble with nonviolent discipline. Most of them didn't. Most of them were very strong that way. But some of that has been documented, like the Minneapolis Daily newspaper documented that some of the first people to start breaking windows or lighting things on fire, they were actually movement opponents. They weren't sort of power elites, but they were right-wing, white supremacist vigilantes who pretended to be white supporters of the movement for Black Lives, and then started trashing and mayhem to encourage police forces around the country to really come down hard on the movement for Black Lives, to try to turn the press coverage and various political leaders like then President Trump and other people were demonizing activists for racial justice and against police brutality as thugs and terrorists. And so I explained that, and just to bring it up to date. Now, let me just check the time. Okay, this is going a little long, so I'll try to speed things up. One of the things is when my book came out, somebody wrote on Twitter saying, and they clearly hadn't read the book, but they had heard the description, and they said, oh, this is just a bunch of left-wing activists blaming the deficiencies of their own movement on, agent provocateurs. They're not taking responsibility. But I have a whole section, the section on pouring oil on a fire, where I do acknowledge and explore the dynamics that it's not just agent provocateurs who behave like this in such destructive ways that harm movements, but there are sincere movement activists who also advocate or engage in what you could describe as agent provocateur-like behavior. And it's in the misguided conviction that this mixing low-level violence with civil resistance makes our movement stronger, more powerful, bigger and more effective. There's not a lot of data that supports that argument. And when I talk with these people, I often point out, well, why, if the behaviors you're advocating are the same thing that agent provocateurs have historically advocated in order to make our movements smaller, weaker, and easier to defeat, doesn't that make you question whether it makes sense? And so that's an important argument. But I also go through some actual, research that has that really questions this notion, because I believe that agent provocateurs are analogous to a virus. And so the movement body is made up of various cells of participation, and you want to have the highest level of immunity to the viruses. And if you have a lot of people who haven't really thought it through well and sort of are arguing for the same thing as agent provocateurs, that's very low immunity, and that increases the potential for real damage in movements losing. But one of the studies that I do is I go back to Erica Chenoweth, and this is sourced from a piece she did called The Rise of Nonviolent Resistance. And it's a great article. It talks about a lot of things, but one of the things she talks about is she extends her research about the effectiveness of civil resistance beyond the 2006 date. And so she brings it up to date, more up to date. And what she noticed was after 2006, civil resistance is still twice as effective as armed resistance, but the success rates of both kinds of popular resistance are going down. And she talks about several different ways this happens, but this chart is interesting. As you can see, starting from 2006, the percentage of nonviolent movements without violent flanks starts dropping radically, and the percentage of nonviolent episodes that include violent flanks, which is either because of agent provocateurs or sincere activists who are behaving like agent provocateurs, it starts going up. And she argues that that's part of why there's a decline in the overall success rate. So again, I try to put things out there that will allow people to think more deeply and empirically rather than their romantic notions about what making social change is, but really get down to some strategy. So the whole point of this book is that we need to understand this stuff, but it's also what can be done. And so I outline about 4 basic principles. One is that we need to avoid the extremes of either doing nothing about agent provocateurs or agent provocateur-like behavior, or try to stop it all by having a rigid and paranoid security culture, which in and of itself, that cure can be worse than the disease in some ways, and I give some examples in the book. And then I also encourage people to focus primarily on minimizing agent provocateur-like behavior, because essentially the behavior is the problem. And undercover agents have one motivation for doing it, and sincere but misguided activists and organizers have a different motivation, but their motivations aren't the main thing that will impact negatively or positively. It's the behavior. And then another thing is, since there are differences in motivations, we need to be careful not to demonize sincere activists and organizers who might be arguing for low-level violence alongside and with actions, because they may be unstrategic but very sincere. And because of that sincerity and their desire for a movement to succeed, they might be persuaded to greater or lesser degrees over time to shift to greater nonviolent discipline and more strategic thinking. And so that's the other principle that I put, is that anybody who cares about the success of their movements has to be willing to debate strategy within movements and learn how to make a strong case about how acting like agent provocateurs is likely to be a losing strategy. And then I outlined some specific actions, and people can read them in the book, and I will just go through them real quick, and then we'll turn it over to questions. And if Maciej is willing and participants are willing, I'm happy to stay beyond just the hour and do, to extend more time for talking. But like, one of the things is take a time as an activist, learn what the empirical research has to say, because we have a lot of conventional thinking and often romantic notions about armed struggle and low-level political violence that is just inaccurate and unhelpful. And then I think a key thing that's happened is educate and train people in civil resistance, and I list some of the dimensions here. But I also think it's important to educate people about how routinely agent provocateurs and what their behaviors are that help weaken resistance movements. It's really helpful to state a clear strategic policy and expectation of nonviolent discipline at civil resistant actions, and to provide pre-action training that will sort of get people to understand the dimensions, and then maybe even practice and do some role plays about how to maintain. A lot of movements have found that it's really helpful to organize small affinity groups that take part in mass action. So there's people, you're not an isolated individual, and there can be mutual aid, and you can provide emotional support and help people sort of keep their heads when faced with, fear or repression. But it's still good, even if you do all that, to have some trained peacekeepers or marshals, they're sometimes called, who work around, and they might work together to isolate sort of random individuals who are behaving like provocateurs. A great example is when in the Serbian campaign led by a youth movement called Otpor that overthrew the dictator Slobodan Milosevic, there would be times at their demonstrations that there would be obvious, what seemed to them obvious agent provocateurs who are trying to do things. And then the marshals, the trained marshals, would sort of surround that person, call a cab, and put the person in the cab, and they had already arranged with these cabbies to drive people far away from the website and then let them out. But it's also, people can be triggered in the moment. They can be committed to nonviolent discipline policy and understand it, but it can be scary. And so the trained peacekeepers can help with de-escalation and just sort of help people deal with things. And then finally, I think doing after-action debriefings among as many participants as you can on what went well and what didn't, and including in that is thinking about, was there likely agent provocateur behavior, and how was it handled? And the guide here is just to constantly improve people's long-term strategic thinking to increase their effectiveness. So with that, let's talk. And again, I'm happy to stay a little longer. I'm sorry that this took quite so much time, but I'd love to hear if there are any questions or comments you want to share and have me address.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Steve, for this rich and thought-provoking presentation. I will just remind people how they can engage in the discussion, and we'll take a couple of questions. We'll 10, 15 more minutes before we'll end this webinar. And you can either type your question in the chat box, and we will then I will read it to Steve, or you can in fact ask your question live by raising your hand, and I will then call on you to introduce yourself briefly and then ask the question to Steve. So while people are thinking about their questions, Steve, I wanted to kind of touch on what we started talking about before your presentation, which was essentially about those who are genuinely thinking that some level of violence is needed or useful, particularly for self-defense. And they might not even necessarily see themselves as agent provocateurs or necessarily even
yeah, there's many dear people. Yeah,
right. So my question would be how to talk with them, and I'm sure that you will find quite a lot of those who would say that small level of violence, pushing back against police, throwing some projectiles to keep the police at bay, so it will not be immediately kind of dispersed, might be in fact useful, and at this particular moment in time, and why in fact you would say that we are undermining the movement and hurting it. So I wanted to start from that, and then we'll go to the questions from participants.
That's a great question, and I think I could tell a story that illustrates that. A few years ago, back when Trump was president, and after the Nazi rally in Virginia, there was a scheduled white supremacist neo-Nazi rally that was going to happen at Lafayette Park across from the White House, sort of in support of Trump, but also sort of pitching white supremacy. And so I was involved in a wide coalition, and it was very wide. It included direct action group, church groups, very conventional reform things that normally went through normal channels. And the idea was, how do we respond? And I remember sitting in this big room of people, and there were people who definitely believed that violence was not just sort of morally justified sometimes if you're being attacked, but going on the offensive could be strategically wise and good. And so some people in this meeting were talking about, we need to be prepared to, bust some heads, fight the police if need to, and do this. And, there were, people who I've heard before, like in groups like Antifa, make sort of these claims of this is what's needed to fight fascism. And I emotionally can sympathize, but I don't think that it's strategic, and it explicitly wasn't. I didn't see it as strategic as this point. And we came to an interesting compromise because the people there weren't hammering away. I didn't think there were any agent provocateurs in the room, but there were people who were saying, you know, let's go and get rough. Other people, including myself, but other people were talking about, well, if we have the counter demonstration with a policy of nonviolent discipline, it'll be bigger. People with children would come, various religious groups that wouldn't be there to, you know, bust heads for Nazis would come, various reform groups would come, and that the bigger that the demonstration would be, the most effective it would be in countering it. And we came to this compromise where a few of the people said, okay, I see your point, I get it. For this action, I will agree to that discipline, and I won't engage in any kind of political violence or vandalism or any destruction at this thing, that is strategically makes sense. But then they reserve the right, if they see a Nazi coming out of the metro or the subway in DC, they might punch him or something like that. And so was this ideal? No, but it was a dialogue where people were thinking strategically together and coming together and created a firm policy of nonviolent discipline for the counter demonstration. And so that to me was a time where I felt the rubber hit the road in how you don't demonize people that you think are strategically off base, but you engage in the dialogue and the debate, and they may come part of the way with you, particularly for a specific action that increases the impact and the chance of success of the action.
Thank you, Steve, for this illustrative example. Right now, I will call Alison Blattner, and I will unmute you, Alison. So please introduce yourself and ask the question to Steve. Alison, you are right now unmuted, and you can go ahead. You are actually muted on your end, so you need to unmute yourself right now.
Oh, okay. There we go. Yeah. Sorry about that. Hi, my name is Allison. I actually took the ICNC's Peace course this fall, learning about civil resistance. Thank you, Dr. Chase, for speaking with us today. My question is specifically about the field of CR research. And like you mentioned, having that evidence-based research is incredibly helpful for cultivating strategic thinking of your campaign. Is there any specific area of research that you think needs to be focused on more, or any sort of CR projects that you've been following at the time that are kind of compelling?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, to me, it's like how to pull it down because there's so many questions. I mean, I think it was a great service when people like Maria Stephan and Erica Chenoweth did sort of the first large N quantitative study comparing the success rates of nonviolent campaigns against, you know, dictators and foreign occupations versus armed struggle against those. That was hugely, but I also like the shift that other people are doing is, okay, that's more and more settled, but now how do we actually work with activists and do research on actual movements where we're pulling apart what can make these even more effective? Because in the 20th century, civil resistance campaigns against dictators and foreign occupations, they won 56% of the time. And armed struggle only won, I think it was 23, 24% of the time. But so the challenge is how to move that even higher. You know, what are the ways that we can do research that's useful to activists and organizers that don't just rely on some of, well, the general approach seems to be better, but what are specific things that we can start doing more and more? And that's why I wanted to do Agent Provocateurs. It was, you know, it shows up in the literature, but I wanted to put it solidly in activist literature from the civil resistance tradition, because I think dealing with this is a key part about raising the success and effective rate. But there's other dimensions of this too. But yeah, that's a good question, and I encourage researchers and activists to be in dialogue about what are the questions they need. In Solidarity 2020 and Beyond, which is a solidarity network that has activist scholars, many of whom are in the global north, but we're trying to start collaborative research projects with movement organizers in the global south. But part of that being collaborative is not just having the researchers come in with the questions they have, but engage with the activists themselves to generate the kinds of questions that they really need and want answered.
Thank you, Steve. I have a question written down and sent by Evan Hoffman, and he is asking, how do we possibly verify that someone in our movement is an agent provocateurs, and what steps should we take if we discover this to be the case? And again, that touches on the issue of kind of naive kind of attitude of people that are genuinely supportive of movement vis-a-vis those who purposefully are placed within the movement or come to the movement to disrupt. So how can we identify or verify, it's not even verify that indeed one is an agent provocateurs, and then how we should act?
It's a great question. And one of the things that helps me think about it is one of the tactics that I've read about in some cases, agent provocateurs will claim that other people in the organization are agent provocateurs to create animosity, to create suspicion and divisions. And so you have to be very careful. You don't want to just be throwing it around because the person could be sincere but misguided. Now, sometimes if you figure out that the person is an agent and you can document it, then I think, sort of isolating that person from the movement and warning other campaigns in the area about it and doing that. Mark Stone, who I mentioned, this longtime agent provocateur in England, when he was found out, his picture was put on a poster with a description of what he'd done. And it was put all over London saying, don't let this person join your movement. So there's times when you do know, but there's a lot of times you're not sure. And so that's why I say the general principle is not to focus on the underlying motivation as their primary thing, but focus on the behavior that's problematic and figure out ways, and some of the ways that I talked about, sort of isolate somebody if whatever their motivation, but if it's going to end up being strategically damaging to the success of the movement, you want to diminish that and isolate it. So I talk a little more depth in the book, but I also think that's a great research question. But you don't want to just go off half-cocked, pointing the finger at people and shouting that they're agent provocateurs, because you may do real damage to your group.
Thank you, Steve. Another listener, Patrick Nolan, he brings up the importance of leaders in nonviolent movements, and just to paraphrase maybe his question, have you seen the the pattern where there was a weak leadership and at the same time a lot of troubles with agent provocateurs and lack of discipline on the part of the movement, and then when there was leaders that they could provide guidelines on how to behave in the context of agent provocateurs infiltrating the movement, or in fact
that's a great question.
And or maybe leaderless movements that did very well without having leaders, and
Well,
including
it's funny because some people talk about, oh, ours is a leaderless movement, but what they may mean is we don't have sort of one super charismatic person who gets to make all the decisions. But, other people have described sort of horizontal and very democratically organized movements as leaderful movements. But it's distributed leadership where people are taking initiative, but clear agreements, keeping minutes. One of the things Agent Provocateurs has done is gotten a hold of the group's finances, and they do embezzling and they create scandals and things like that. So it's like organizing well and effectively, having mutual accountability, having clear lines of leadership and decision-making structures rather than sort of a laissez-faire, oh, anything goes and it's completely informal. That is, groups like that in certain situations can be sort of creative, but if they stay like that, they don't grow really well. And they also don't have a high level of immunity against the damage that can be done by an agent provocateur. So I think the idea of thinking through what is competent, democratic, and accountable leadership, and how is it distributed, and how is our movement organizations and actions organized really well with various roles, and people know what they're supposed to do when they're supposed to do it. That's hugely helpful in making a movement group less vulnerable to agent provocateurs.
Thank you, Steve. So we are coming to an end of the webinar, and I have time just for one more question, and then we'll conclude. And when I was scrolling down through different responses, there was one with regard to, and let me find that. Yes, it came from Electra Lennartson, who was saying that what is the role of media when such a thing occurs, meaning violence provoked by agent provocateurs, and they decide to portray the violence initiated by provocateurs instead of the majority's movement narrative? Should they, media, have some responsibility for what they are telling to the outside world, and how basically to work with media, even though you've got that agent provocateurs on the fringes of the movement that might in fact grab media attention. So how basically to plan and strategize around that media can in fact be hijacked because they might what bleeds it leads. So how to handle that situation with media?
That's a great question, and I just want to say hi to Electra, who is living in Sweden, and she's one of the new interns for Solidarity 2020 and beyond. So I'm thrilled that she took the time out to join this. But media is very important. One is, sure, the media should be responsible for understanding better about civil resistance movements, being able to analyze things well, to be open to notions of agent provocateurs and looking carefully at that. That's one of the reasons that I wanted to do the clip from the BBC, but there's other examples of media folks doing this really well. But strategically, you also, as a movement organizer, you have to be aware that the coverage, if 98% of a mass demonstration is militant but disciplined and nonviolent, it executes what it does and stuff, and you have 12 people breaking windows at the side of it who seem somehow linked to the campaign, that's what most media will focus on. Certainly the corporate media will focus on. I remember being at an international demonstration in Quebec, And there was tear gas and there was rubber bullets, and most people were engaging in very creative civil resistance tactics. But there were a few people, some of whom were likely very sincere, sort of what at the time was described as the Black Bloc, but some of which were easily infiltrated by agent provocateurs, who were throwing rocks and bottles, smashing windows, doing things that scared people in the neighborhood. And it was interesting in Canada, when I watched the news, it was very balanced. It showed that, it explained possible ideas, but it also showed the other thing. But when I brought my students back and myself back to the United States, and I was looking at US press coverage, it was all about the few people who were engaging in unproductive, unstrategic activities. And so part of the reason you need to avoid agent provocateur-like behavior is because a lot of the media is going to go for that, and they will be complicit in demonizing activists and helping justify repression and having people be unsympathetic to the movement. So some journalists do it well. We need to reach out and engage with media, let them, and be useful with that. But we also have to expect a lot of the mass media is going to get it wrong, focus on the wrong things, and be complicit in trying to harm our movements. So it's a great question, and I think that goes back to one of the first questions we had. Is that would be a really good area to research and to develop educational materials for journalists who are sincere and want to do a good job. And ICNC actually has a really nice small booklet for journalists that'll help them sort of understand the dynamics of civil resistance and what's going on and how to report on it in a more sophisticated and interesting way. So great question.
Right, thank you, Steve. So we came to the end of our webinar, and I would like to again thank you for your presentation and for your informed, insightful responses to a number of questions we received. I couldn't go through all of them, there was no time, so we'll make sure to send you the questions that we didn't have chance to touch on. And I just want to remind everyone that your book, published by ICNC, How Agents Provocateurs Harm Our Movements, is available for free and can be downloaded from the ICNC website. And it's accessible to everyone who might be, who is interested in it. And again, it's available for free. At this point, I would like to thank everyone. You can follow us or you can subscribe to receive information about our programs, about webinars, and about our publications and upcoming publications by subscribing and going to our website and subscribing to receive that information. You can follow us on Twitter as well as on Facebook. And those who had the chance to register for that webinar with Steve, they will receive the link to the recorded webinar together with the link to the free publication, so you can easily find that and have this in your own library. So again, thank you, Steve, for joining us. I thank everyone for spending time with us, and I wish everyone good day, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on the time zone. And please stay well and healthy. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Maciej. I'm so grateful to have been able to do that. Enjoy the rest of your day, folks.